In Dan in His Van episode 21, I was going to talk about mixing and really in that area of recording and how you mix as you go. Now, I always like to get the drums and the bass really nice before I continue with guitars, because when you're playing against something, you need to feel as if you're really there with it in terms of the balance and the level and the sounds and the nice stereo-ness and all of that. But I also thought it prudent to talk a little bit about how I started to do this. When I was a kid, with me and my brother, he played drums, I played bass, and then we did vocals and guitars and all that afterwards. We used to record with 2 tape recorders and a mixing desk and a very small mixer. We had a couple of mics and I had my bass amp and all of that stuff. So what we used to do was to have our 2 PZM microphones, fantastic quality for the money. They were £30 each. Brilliant. So we used to put a couple of PZMs basically over the drums to get a stereo sound, and then on my bass amp I'd have a microphone in front of it. And then those 3 mics went into the little mixing desk and then onto the cassette recorder. Now, what we used to do was to record a bit of bass and drums onto the cassette recorder, and then we'd have to listen back because, of course, we couldn't mix it unless we, recorded on 1 track each. But we wanted the drums in stereo, so it had to go onto the machine as a mix. So we'd listen back and work out if the kick drum and the bass guitar had roughly the same sort of presence in that low frequency. And if it was, then great. So what we'd have to do then, after that, we'd have to record the entire song. And then at the end, we'd take the tape and plug that back into the mixing desk, and then have another tape recorder which would record the next track. Now, the next track had to be the tape recorder from the bass and drums, going through the mixing desk with any necessary tweaks. Usually I'd put a little bit of bass on at that point to accentuate the bass drum and the bass guitar, and then record the rhythm guitar through another input of the mixing desk, which would then feed the second tape recorder. So play a bit of guitar, stop, rewind, go back to the beginning, check that the mix was right before continuing. Because, of course, when you're rendering onto a cassette recorder with another cassette recorder and a guitar, you can't mix afterwards. So everything had to be done at the time. And actually, it was a lot of fun. And if there were mistakes, you just kind of had to live with them. And actually, mistakes is how we learn things. So when you listen back and you think, oh, that guitar was a bit iffy, oh no, or it was too trebly, or it's too loud with respect to the bass and the drums, you'd know for next time. Which is why when I do a mix now on my digital audio workstation, where I have every single control and bell and whistle on earth, usually what I find is at the end, when I've got everything together, I have to do very little mixing, because those lessons that I learnt recording with 2 tape recorders basically came into play. So after you'd recorded your second take, the rhythm guitar, you'd then do exactly the same process. You get that tape, put it back through the mixing desk, and then record the lead guitar while you're going back to the other tape recorder. And of course that had to be right as well. You had to decide if there was reverb on that lead guitar. That had to be decided at the time. Because, of course, if you put reverb on the entire mix, all the drums and the bass would have it on as well, which I didn't want. I wanted the lead guitar to be present over the other mix. So you'd have your guitar and your reverb and the other cassette machine, and then that would go over to back to the first cassette recorder on a new piece of tape. So I used to keep all of the takes just in case it was so bad that we had to start again, given that we had a good bass and drums to start with. So it really was a sort of suck it and see, just make sure everything is as right as we can possibly get it before we carry on. And then things like the vocals at the end. Now, we didn't have a compressor, so we would have to do a bit of practice with riding the fader on the vocals. So if my brother was singing, I'd be on the fader just doing this, knowing where the words were going to come, and then a pair of headphones just to try and make it so that those vocals didn't peak the other tape recorder, or indeed didn't just go over the mix so loudly that you couldn't listen to it anymore. So a lot of that fader riding, you'll find this on plugins, that there are compressor plugins, but there's also a plugin which does exactly that. It rides the fader, which is a completely different sound from a compressor, because it's really sort of based on that manual control of pulling the fader down where there is an attack of a word and then pushing it back up just after that attack. And it took a lot of practice, but that was great fun as well. Everything that I learnt doing it that way has actually made my mixing life in Digital Audio Workstation, Logic or Cubase or GarageBand for iOS or whatever it is, it's made the things so much easier, because I do minimal post-production. Everything I try and do is laid down at the time, and it makes musical sense to do it that way. Now, of course, you shouldn't stop yourself from correcting any problems on Logic or whatever. If there's something that's too loud, obviously you've got to pull it down. So really, that's my take on mixing on the fly. I think it's really important, because not only do the overdubs, not only are they more comfortable to record, but you're also getting a sound. You're building that organic sound up from nothing.